traditionally corrupt and largely dysfunctional leadership entity?
Well, there are two issues, and they're separate issues. One issue is, has any significant component of the Palestinian leadership been significantly an obstacle to resolving the conflict? And there the answer, to my thinking, based on looking at the record, the answer is no. Whether or not you like Hamas, the fact of the matter is that Hamas has, in recent years, in particular, since its winning of the election, the parliamentary election in 2006, Hamas has repeatedly said it's willing to accept a settlement on the June 1967 border. It echoes the same terms of the United Nations General Assembly, the International Court of Justice, and so forth. And so if you look at, has either side, or I should say either major component of the Palestinian leadership, whether Hamas or the Palestinian Authority, have they blocked a settlement? I think the answer is clearly and unambiguously no. But there's a second question. Have they pursued a strategy that's likely to mobilize the Palestinian population? Because in the absence of mobilizing the population in order to end the occupation, it's very unlikely that anything we do can bring about an end to the conflict. At the end of the day, the biggest resource the Palestinian people have is the Palestinian people. 4 million of those people mobilized and challenging Israel in its daily enforcements of the occupation. If you mobilize them, organize them, I think, it would take me some time to demonstrate it, but I think I can, they can defeat the Israeli occupation, of course, with our support. We have to be clear about that. And that's possible. I had dinner the other evening with the Indian writer Arundhati Roy, and she makes the perfectly, or made the perfectly obvious point, because she's constantly under assault for supporting what are called the Maoists in India. And she says, look, when you have people living in an obscure corner of the planet, nobody's paying attention to them. Nobody could care less whether they're living or dead. And the Indian government, in this case, comes in and commits the most horrendous and horrific atrocities. To talk about nonviolence in that context is simply nonsense. It will never work, because if the cameras are away, the Indian government will carry on the way any government with power carries on in order to preserve its power and its privilege. But the case of Palestine is different, because for various historical reasons, the cameras don't turn away from it. In fact, the cameras stay focused on it. And if we do our share here to publicize that the Palestinians are not asking for the stars, the moon, and the sky, when they march, when they demonstrate, as they do daily in various parts of the West Bank to protest the illegal wall that Israel has been building, they're just asking for their rights under international law. If we do our share to clarify what's going on, and they do, or I should say, assume the much bigger burden of being on the front lines, yes, it's true, Israel will kill them. Will kill quite a lot of them. But I think well short of a massacre, the sorts of massacres that occur in those obscure zones of India, for example, well short of those massacres, they will be forced to stop. They can't do it. Not because they're nice people, and not because, incidentally, they're worse than others, but because, if we can use that expression, which I think is a valid expression, international public opinion won't tolerate it. And the more we're organized, the less public opinion will tolerate it, and the sooner Israel will be forced to desist. Again, not attributing any kind of special humanity to the Israelis. That's the fact of politics. They can't do it. That's the world in which we live. So I think the tactic can work, but it depends on mobilizing the Palestinians, and neither of the main Palestinian political factions, for various reasons, are ready to do that. And that's, I think, the problem. But we should not confuse that with the fact that the Palestinians are not an obstacle to resolving the conflict. Everyone is ready except the Israelis. If you saw just this past week, the Palestinians, the map I showed you, it happens by coincidence that as we speak now, just this past week, the Palestinians passed the map to what's called the Quartet, this kind of silly negotiating body not worth talking about. And the Israelis rejected it. They said, we have to go into direct negotiations. But direct negotiations for what? The map I showed you, it was rejected by Israel already in May 2008. So what's the point of presenting it again? The point is to start up the negotiations again. The wheels on the bus go round and round, round and round. And that's what we have to put a stop to. If the Palestinians had any sense, they wouldn't be presenting the map to the Quartet, the most morally bankrupt quartet on God's earth. They wouldn't be presenting it to the Israelis. They would, if I can sound a little bit immodest, they would be doing what I did. Show it to all of you. Show it to the public. There's a reasonable way to resolve the problem. That's how you achieve a peace, I think.
Let me just close by asking about the Israeli lobby. And I know that you have challenged Walt and Mearsheimer's contention that the Israeli policy lobby is able to drive American foreign policy. Many people see it as a force that makes it extremely difficult within the American political establishment to defy, let's not call them Israeli interests, but certainly right-wing Israeli interests.
Well, the problem with discussions about the lobby is they typically take the either-or form. Either, some people believe, that the lobby determines U.S. foreign policy. That's the famous tail wagging the dog theory. Sometimes it takes rather extreme forms. I spoke last week at a conference in Chicago, the American Muslims for Palestine, a very decent group of people, and there was somebody sitting next to me. She did not only think that the lobby determines American foreign policy now, but she was convinced that, in her words, her terminology, not mine, the Zionists in the form of Louis Brandeis was responsible for World War I. Well, that's a stretch. And then there are others who say that it's U.S. foreign policy interests that determine all U.S. policy in the region, and the lobby is, in effect, a cipher. It doesn't really wield any power when it comes into conflict with U.S. interests. I think the picture is not one and not the other. When it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, if we can use the term, the local conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, I think it's true, it's the lobby. Because however you configure this term, national interest, it's impossible to conceive, as far as I can tell, any notion of U.S. national interest, whatever it might mean, that can include support for the settlements, the occupation, the colonization by Israel of the West Bank. A simple thought experiment. If tomorrow, miracle of miracles, Mr. Netanyahu announced Israelis are packing their bags and they're moving back to the June '67 border, it's very hard to imagine anyone in the American administration who would be unhappy with that decision. You know Mr. Obama would be very pleased, and stupefying narcissist that he is, he would take credit for it.